So we're picking up here pretty much with where we left off with the lecture prior to the last one. We talked about the political fragmentation of the, shall we say, Islamic world. And I want to be clear when I use the term Islamic in this sense, right? The idea of an Islamic world. I'm kind of referring to the fact that we have Islam has kind of laid the foundation for a new civilization to emerge. So something much broader than Islam as, constituting a very specific religion comprising a, very defined set of beliefs and practices. At this point, it actually includes the majority of the people living in this new civilization are in fact not Muslim. It's going to be a while before the majority of people in the Middle East, inclusive of Iran and eventually much of North Africa, are actually Muslim. So, I just want to be clear about that. And we kind of left off the political fragmentation of the Islamic world had a lot to do with the creation of a new warrior caste, if you will, the Mamluks, slave soldiers, many of them of Turkic background. So we talked about how you have these migrations kind of in waves of Turkic people coming from Central Asia, many of them inducted into the service of the Caliphate as soldiers. And eventually their numbers are going to become substantial, right? And we talked about Mamluks, basically the term literally meaning own. The idea that these are individuals devoted to the caliph, but over time they become very powerful and eventually are able to challenge the authority of the caliph himself. And that's part of why you have this political fragmentation. Many of them establishing new kingdoms or sultanates, so some of them taking on the title sultan, indicative of the fact that they had political authority over these newly established kingdoms. Many of them had started off as military commanders or perhaps had been appointed as regional governors and then eventually had asserted their independence or, again, establishing these sultanates. The caliphate would continue, but at some point the caliph becoming a figurehead representative of the religious authority of the ulama, but not having any real power themselves, right? But kind of also reflecting the idea that there is some sense of unity across the Muslim world. And this all started under Mu'tasim, who reigned from 833 to 842. It's going to take a while to evolve, right? So the caliphs will continue to have power for some time, but eventually their actual political authority fading out. We talked about how eventually the ulama came to have religious authority, but the caliphs would continue as figureheads, kind of representative of, this idea of a kind of unified Islamic world. And during this period, the Islamic world, or realm of Islamic states, is also going to continue to expand, very often at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. Very important in regard to this will be what are known as warriors of the faith, or Ghazis. So these are individuals who very often fight along the frontiers and end up expanding territory under the control of these Islamic kingdoms. And so very often they would fight to defend the realm of Islam, but there was also the idea that wherever possible you should expand it. And we should be clear here, right? In theory, they're expanding territory under the control of their kingdoms in order to spread the faith. But in many ways, it's really kind of using this as a justification for expanding their kingdoms or sultanates. So, this is kind of the name of the game globally during this period, right? The same thing going on in Europe, where various monarchs are attempting to expand their kingdoms and very often using Christianity as a way of justifying it, that that legitimizes their taking territory under their control, particularly if there are parts of the world that were under pagan control, parts of Europe in the north and the east. Same basic idea, right? And so this also will lead to the establishment of new dynasties, part of this political fragmentation of the Islamic world. Two good examples of this are the Ghaznavid and Seljuk dynasties. But this idea of having warriors of the faith who are kind of stationed on the frontier to defend the kingdom but also expand it will carry on well into Ottoman times, as per the image that you see here. And we might note we're going to see a lot of variation in terms of the various sultanates that are established. For instance, in some cases adopting Shiism, as in the case of the Buyids, who gained control of Iraq and Persia, roughly modern-day Iran, from 945 to 1060. By the way, that will mark the end, the formal end of the Abbasid Empire as a political entity, inasmuch as that brings Baghdad, where the caliphate is based, under their control right at the start of their of the establishment of this new dynasty in 945. Now, what's kind of interesting is the Buyids will never try to impose Shiism on the Muslim population there, so for the vast majority of them will remain Sunni, and they even don't try to get rid of the caliphs or try to convert them to Shiism, but at that point they really are little more than figureheads. One consequence of the establishment of a Shiite dynasty in the heartland of the Islamic world, kind of separating the eastern part of the Islamic world from much of the Middle East. And related to that, we're going to see the establishment of a new dynasty in the eastern part under the Samanids. And, kind of also reflecting a point at which they're developing a distinct culture, right? Something evidenced by the images on the right. We see kind of an architectural structure, an artifact, what looks like a kind of dish, but kind of certain artistic designs that would correspond to the Samanids. And the territory we're talking about roughly corresponding to the northeast part of present-day Iran and much of Central Asia, right? So this kind of development going to impact kind of cultural developments in Central Asia up until the present. You can see Bukhara and Samarkand, two very important Islamic centers of learning that will have a very distinct character culturally, among other things, also linguistically, and located in present-day Uzbekistan. To the west of the Buyids, we see the establishment of a Sunni dynasty, the Ghazvinids dynasty. We already mentioned them very briefly, but it's a really good example of how this kind of thing would eventually happen. So, first of all, the Ghazvinid dynasty, lasting from 962 until 1187, established by a Turkic slave general. That actually also reflects the fact that the kind of political elite increasingly becoming non-Arab, either Persian or Turkic or some combination of both. And what happened here is that this particular slave general had been given authority by the caliph, or in a sense the caliph legitimized his authority over a particular territory known as an iqta, or land grant. And then very shortly after that, this individual had proclaimed himself sultan, thus signifying Ghaznavid independence from caliphal authority. And eventually they would actually conquer much of the Middle East, kind of reuniting many of these territories, and among other things, bringing the Buyid dynasty to an end. And here you can see the empire, the Ghaznavid Empire at its greatest extent. So also kind of reestablishing Sunnism as the dominant form of Islam throughout the region. But again, reminding you that the Buyids had actually never sought to convert the population to Shiism. So it really never took root by the time the Ghazvinids had reconquered that territory for Sunnism. Probably most important would be the Seljuk dynasty, another Turkic dynasty established under a fellow named Toghrul Beg, and they will eventually reunite most of the Islamic world, at least temporarily. And that will actually bring us up to the time of the Crusades. So here we see the Seljuk Empire at its greatest extent. So reuniting the Islamic world under Sunnism, but also greatly expanding it at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. It should be evident from the map here. We can see that a great deal of territory in Anatolia, roughly corresponding to modern-day Turkey, has come under Seljuk control. The decisive battle in this regard would be the Battle of Manzikert, which took place in 1071, more precisely August 26th, 1071, near the town of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. And it was a decisive defeat. The emperor was captured, and the Byzantine Empire lost a tremendous amount of territory and really beginning to feel threatened. Now the Islamic world is encroaching very close to the capital of Constantinople, And this is going to, by the way, and we're going to come back to this momentarily, but it's going to be a major factor leading to the Crusades. And before we talk about the Crusades, among other things, we should say a few words about the other really major empire to emerge in the period leading up to them, and that is the Fatimid Empire based in Egypt, which is actually Shiite, and also claims to be a caliphate, thus challenging the authority of the Sunni caliph in Baghdad. So it's actually founded in North Africa by a fellow named Sayyid ibn Hussein. He takes the title Abdullah al-Mahdi. By this point, in Islam, you have this idea about how at the end of days, where there's kind of a day of judgment, there's a figure known as the Mahdi who will appear and will play a very important role. Not that dissimilar from how many Christians imagine the role of Jesus in the end days. And so sometimes political figures would take this title as a way of kind of drawing attention to, trying to legitimize their rule and so forth, that they were in some sense kind of ordained by God. In any event, this new empire will be established in most of North Africa fairly quickly. And then al-Mahdi's successors will eventually capture Egypt, where they establish their capital, El-Kahrat. So known to us as Cairo. It's a new city at that point, but established very close to Fustat, which it eventually will absorb. And so I mentioned that they're Shiite. What's really interesting is that they are in fact Seveners or Ismailis, and they kind of use that as a way of legitimizing their right to rule. They claim to be descended from Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet of Islam, through Hussein and the Ismaili line of imams. Now, by the way, they do not claim to be imams, but they do use this connection as a way of legitimizing their right to govern. So here we see the Fatimid Empire at its greatest extent. And in the period leading up to the Crusades, the Fatimids would often be in conflict with the Seljuks, and the territory between them would go back and forth in terms of who controlled it. A territory roughly corresponding to present-day Syria, Israel, Palestine, and parts of Saudi Arabia, centered around what you see on the map where Damascus is located. And by the way, that would also be a factor leading up to the Crusades, as this would have a rather negative impact on the situation in Jerusalem. Not marked there, but that would have been in that territory, not far from Damascus. And this would, related to that, it would have a very negative impact on Christian pilgrims visiting the area. In any event, this is pretty much what the Middle East looks like politically on the eve of the Crusades. Divided between three empires. The Seljuks indicated here in green, the Fatimids indicated in red, and then what remains of the Byzantine Empire in orange. One last thing before we turn to the Crusades, because, we've been talking a lot about how politically fragmented the Islamic world has become at this point. Even if the Seljuks were able to, what will prove to be temporarily, reunite much of it politically, but we don't want to exaggerate what that meant for how people understand their kind of social and cultural world. Many people living in the Islamic world still felt connected to other political states, and a lot of this had to do with the ulama, right? So for most people, the political authority at the highest level, if you're talking about sultans, doesn't have really much of a direct impact on how you live your life. Most of that is run by the ulama, and to a very large extent, local affairs are managed by local authority, right? So in some ways, the ulama constituting what today we might think of as a municipal authority, and they are very heavily interconnected, right? They interact with one another a great deal, many of them moving back and forth in terms of getting an education, moving from one important member of the ulama where they learn something, and then eventually traveling to another one where they learn something else, and eventually establishing their own reputation. They might end up holding an important position in connection with the mosque in a particular community, as a judge, as a qadi. And so, the political authority at the highest level, the sultans, and at this point we really can't speak of caliphs having political authority, but generally the sultans would allow the ulama to manage affairs at the local level in connection with Sharia. So kind of the idea that as long as the Sultan didn't interfere with the ulama, in principle they upheld Sharia, which understood broadly is pretty much better to think of as a process in terms of how members of the ulama dealt with various kind of political situations on the ground, whether in terms of Islamic rulings or the role of the mosque within the local community, sometimes kind of resolving situations in a more informal way and so forth. In connection with waqfs, we haven't talked about waqfs. The waqf is best translated as a religious endowment. So within Islam, from a pretty early point, you have the idea that a particular territory and its economic, whatever economic value it has, can be devoted to a particular function. That it might provide a resource for maintaining a mosque. It might be utilized in order to fund an orphanage, in order to fund a religious school, and so forth. Ulama, members of the ulama would also be responsible for managing these, so they're also a very important kind of financial resource for members of the ulama, a kind of major aspect of why they have any kind of authority. By the way, the plural for waqf in Arabic is awqaf. In English, we might say waqfs. So this kind of institution has also become very important in the sense of unifying the Islamic world socially, culturally, also religiously. But all of this kind of managed by the ulama. Again, the singular for ulama, alim. We might expand a bit on the nature of the relationship between the sultans, right, the political elite. And that would also include the commanders of armies, advisors to the sultan, so forth. So between the political elite as represented by the sultan and the ulama, right? So we already mentioned the basic idea is the sultan should uphold Sharia, which was in effect to basically accept the fact that the ulama would manage affairs at the local level. But then there were other ways in which the sultan might actively promote members of the ulama and thus garner their support as a way of further legitimizing their right to rule. One obvious way would be to build a mosque, and of course you would provide the resources for that. You would probably have a role in arranging which members of the ulama would be in charge of the mosque, and then those individuals would be devoted to you. You might designate territory that you've gained control over as a waqf, and again, putting certain members of the ulama in charge of that. And then finally, you might also develop a religious school. So, obviously building the infrastructure for that, but also providing the resources, perhaps through a waqf, in order to fund it. And this became a very, very important development under the Seljuks. They would promote madrasas or schools throughout their territory. I should note the plural in Arabic is madaris, so madrasa singular. And these were religious schools, but very often they would engage in other kinds of learning, but primarily to educate prospective members of the ulama, either people entering their ranks or helping them to advance once they were a member of the ulama. This also, again, is helping to unify the Islamic world because members of the ulama, or individuals who had just become members of the ulama and are continuing to receive training would move from one madrasa to another. And therefore, there'd be a tremendous kind of network that would develop connecting different parts of the Islamic world, in connection with these schools, right? Also, the mosque would also function a bit in that way. But again, right, the main point I want you to take away here, and this kind of ties into some of the assigned reading, is that whatever is going on politically, however politically fragmented the Islamic world has become by this point, there's still very much a sense of cultural, social, and religious unity, again, very much in connection with the ulama. And on that note, we might also note that during this period, we see the establishment of institutions of higher learning, probably the most famous being that of Al-Azhar, centered around a mosque in Cairo, actually built by the Fatimids, but eventually becoming one of the most important centers of learning in Sunni Islam, beginning in 970. Some would argue that it is the oldest continuously running university in the world today. Well, speaking of the Fatimids, we now come back to the Crusades and beginning by looking at immediate events and developments that would lead up to it. One very important one would be the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by the 6th Fatimid Caliph, Tariq al-Hakam. So he ruled Egypt from 996 to 1021, and during his reign, Jerusalem was under Fatimid control. So first of all, just in case you don't know what the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, it is a church that was built on the site that Christian tradition by this point came to hold that is where Jesus was crucified, buried, and then eventually rose from the grave. And that is, of course, kind of a central belief to Christianity. You know, the idea that Jesus died for our sins and then he was reborn. And if you believe in him, then essentially on a spiritual level, the same thing happens to you. So a church had been built on that site. By the way, it still exists today. The images you see there are present day. But in any event, this by this point this site had become a very important center of Christian pilgrimage. Many of these pilgrims coming from Europe, and so word of its destruction is going to get back to Europe, and that will eventually become a factor leading to the Crusades. Right? There's kind of this growing concern in Europe that Christian pilgrims are being persecuted, that Christian holy sites are being desecrated, and so forth. So why did he do it? Why did Tariq al-Hakam destroy the church? This, to be clear, was a very unusual action by a sultan or anyone with political authority. Nothing like this had ever happened before. As you might recall, we've talked a great deal about the fact that Islam is very tolerant of their fellow monotheists, and in fact had an obligation to safeguard Christian churches and Jewish synagogues. Certainly ones that were, very important centers of pilgrimage. And so this was a very unusual thing, and most historians feel that basically maybe two factors here, that he was somewhat crazy, eventually came to see himself as being God incarnate, and the other thing is apparently had issues with his Christian mom. In any event, his successor, very apologetic about it, and would actually have a hand in cooperation with the Byzantine Empire in rebuilding it. So, again, very unusual thing, but nonetheless, word of this would get back to Europe, and this would constitute an important factor leading to the Crusades. The other important factor we already looked at, the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. So this was a battle that where the Byzantine Empire suffered a humiliating defeat. And the emperor at that time, Alexius I, would then appeal to the West for help. There was really a feeling that the Byzantine Empire was in danger of being destroyed. And then in Europe, a fear that without the Byzantine Empire to act as a kind of front line of defense against Islamic expansion, eventually all of Europe would be overrun. So you might recall that the predecessor of Alexius I, Romanos IV, had actually been captured, right? So this was a really humiliating defeat. But more importantly, this really is going to make many people in Europe fearful that somehow the quote-unquote infidel is about to overrun Christian Europe. And so here we see the Emperor Alexius I, Komnenos. I said he appeals to the West. What does that actually mean in practice? More specifically, he is going to appeal to the head of Western Christendom, Pope Urban II, whose real name was Otho of Lagery. So by the way, just in case you're not aware, at this point, Christendom is actually really consists of two major sects. There's a few other minor ones as well in various locations, but primarily you have Catholics in the western part of Europe under the authority of the Pope, and then you have Christian Orthodoxy in the east, centered in the Byzantine Empire, eventually going to spread to much of East Europe, most notably today Russia. They do not recognize the authority of the Pope. In fact, they don't recognize any one individual as having that level of authority, though they do have patriarchs that have a very high rank, but all of them are co-equal. In fact, the Pope had initially started as a patriarch before they promoted the idea that took hold in Western Europe that the Patriarch of Rome had special authority, and at some point started referring to him as Pope, which literally means father. But by the way, also in connection with this political division within the church hierarchy, Orthodoxy and Catholicism developing in very different ways. So in many ways, in terms of actual practices, in terms of how churches look, in terms of liturgical language, in the Catholic Church they use Latin at this point, in Orthodoxy they use Greek. Very different, right? If you were a Catholic visiting an Orthodox church at that time, or vice versa, it would have felt very foreign to you. And this is important to know. What did Alexius want? He wanted Western Europe to send an army that would fight under his command alongside the Byzantine army to push back the Muslims, or infidel as they would have called them, and regain territory in Anatolia. And as you can see from this map, the Islamic world has really expanded within arm's reach almost of Constantinople. I mean, this would have felt very threatening, but their main goal, again, is they really just want to push back. They want to regain territory they lost, make sure that Constantinople is not that close to the frontier of their empire. So that's kind of what they're hoping for. What they're going to get is very different. The Pope is going to respond to this call for help by convening the Council of Clermont in 1095. And basically, Urban II is going to call upon Christians to take up their weapons to liberate the Holy Land. From their point of view, liberate in the sense that, to their mind, the Holy Land should be under Christian control. Holy Land, of course, corresponding to Jerusalem and the surrounding environs, roughly corresponding to the modern states of Israel, Palestine. We can help the Byzantine Empire along the way, but the primary goal is to recover the Holy Land, right? And then on top of that, the Pope is going to promise that anyone who does that, anyone who dies in battle against pagans, liberating the Holy Land, would be forgiven for their sins, right? There would be a remission of sins. They would no longer have to go to purgatory. They'd have a one-way ticket to heaven. Now, we should note the term Crusades is actually one used by historians after the fact. The individuals who took part in these military campaigns, and by the way, there would be a series of them. We're mostly focusing here on the First Crusade. They didn't refer to them as Crusades, right? The basic idea is that a crusade, by definition, is in the name of Christendom and sanctioned by the Pope. So meaning they're of a religious character. There's kind of the idea that you're both waging warfare, but also in a sense performing a pilgrimage. There's a kind of sacredness to what you're doing in connection with holy sites. And ultimately, the aim, particularly the First Crusade, is to recapture Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslims, and of secondary importance, supporting the Byzantine Empire against Seljuk expansion. Now, this First Crusade is going to be primarily led by knights, mostly combatants, nobody really of royal lineage, not having kings. Other crusades will feature kings. There will even be some primarily led by non-combatants, peasants and so forth, even in one case, very young individuals, the Children's Crusade. So this First Crusade, when they set out, is primarily involving knights, and we should note they do stop at Constantinople along the way. There's kind of the idea that, maybe they can help out, but it's pretty clear they have no intention of fighting under the authority of the Byzantine emperor, that they're going to operate independently. They really have trouble relating to the people living in Constantinople. From their point of view, they seem very foreign. From the point of view of the subjects of the Byzantine Empire, the Crusaders are fairly barbaric. In many ways, Europe in this period will be perceived as being very backwards, very uncivilized. This is a perception that many Muslims will share. And arguably, civilization in the Islamic world much more highly developed, as well as in the Byzantine Empire. eventually the Byzantine emperor is going to send them on their way. It becomes clear that they're not really there to help. They're more trouble than they're worth. They actually insist that they camp outside the city, and eventually sending them on their way. And then eventually they make it to the Holy Land. The major battle will be in connection with Jerusalem. By all accounts, a bloody affair. Even by the accounts of the Crusaders, they basically slaughter everyone in their way, whether they are combatants or not. In many cases, whether they are Muslim or not, from their point of view, when they encounter Christians and Jews, these seem just very foreign. They don't seem somehow like Christians to them. In particular, they have a very negative attitude towards Jews, and in fact, along the way, even while they were still in Europe, they had killed many Jews when they should encounter a Jewish community. A lot of anti-Semitism in connection with that. But they do take Jerusalem and eventually much of the Holy Land and some additional territory, and establish a number of Crusader states, four to be exact. The most important being the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, but you also have Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli. On this map, you'll also see that they established a large number of castles and will actually maintain control of much of this territory until around the 12th century, at which point eventually they will be forced out. It's actually going to take the Muslim world a bit of time to become united in opposition, kind of get their act together and push back on the Crusader states. So that's kind of one major factor in why they're able to carry on for a while. Also kind of reflecting that as important as Jerusalem is to Islam, in the period leading up to the Crusades, it had become something of a backwater. I mean, this wasn't really a very important political or economic center. But in any event, the Crusader states will carry on for some time. In the meantime, the Seljuk Empire will eventually fragment into a sizable number of smaller sultanates, very often warring with one another, in some cases even forming alliances with Crusader states and, against other Muslim kingdoms. And then finally, you have one other destabilizing factor. This is the period where the Shia Ismaili sect that we learned about earlier, the Hashashim, become very active. You might recall we get the word assassins from this sect. Hashashim referring to this idea that before carrying out an assassination, and these assassinations were of Sunni political figures, it wasn't directed at the Crusader states, supposedly they would smoke hash. We're not sure exactly how factual that is, but in any event, they proved to be a destabilizing factor. Eventually, a leader will emerge in the Muslim world able to unite them and drive out the Crusaders, at least from most of the territory that they had managed to conquer. And that individual is Saladin, literally meaning the defender of the faith in Arabic. The full name, Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub. In English, we refer to him as Saladin. And he lived between 1138 and 1193. So obviously this is a bit of time has passed since the Crusader states had been established. He is actually Kurdish. He was a military leader at some point sent to conquer the Fatimids, which he did, and then kind of took over and then united Egypt with Syria and eventually created a kingdom essentially surrounding the Crusader states, on the basis of which he was able to drive them out. The Crusaders would maintain a foothold in the city of Acre for a bit of time, but eventually they would be forced to leave completely. In the meantime, Saladin will establish a new dynasty based in Egypt, in Cairo, the Ayyubid dynasty. And they actually carry on for some time, but they do have one major feature that actually is kind of destabilizing. They don't really have a proper mechanism for determining the line of succession. Whenever a sultan dies, basically the territory is divided between his heirs, his sons, and then they fight it out with their respective armies, each one having created a Mamluk army. Mamluks are still around, these kind of slave soldiers that are, in this case, devoted to the various heirs. And, somebody would usually end up winning, would then absorb all the other Mamluk armies, but then the same thing would happen again. So it does carry on for some time, but this is not really a good recipe for kind of stable government. So if we look at the Middle East, shortly after the establishment of the Ayyubid Empire, it kind of looks like this, right? So you have the Ayyubid Empire based in Egypt, sometimes conquering territory in Syria and along the western side of Arabia. You'll see on this map we still have the Crusader states that are eventually taken. They're indicated here in pink, and those territories will eventually be part of the Ayyubid Empire. As I mentioned, the Crusaders will maintain a bit of a foothold, partly because Saladin allows it. He actually proves to be very gracious in victory. Basically, not only kind of allowing the Crusaders to maintain a foothold, but ensuring the safety of Christian pilgrims coming from Europe, and actually allowing Christians to take whatever property they had if and when they left the territory now under his control. And that, by the way, both things very unusual at that time for somebody who had just won. Saladin actually ends up having a really good reputation, not just in the Arab world, often seen as an Arab hero, even though he's actually Kurdish, which is a different ethnicity, but also seen very favorably among Europeans. You'll notice, though, that the Middle East here, we come back to the map, very fragmented. You have many different kingdoms, sultanates, and so forth. You even have a Christian kingdom indicated here in green, known as Little Armenia. And so the Middle East, very politically fragmented at this time. The Ayyubids will at some point take over a good part of the Middle East, but they never really managed to reunify all of the Islamic world. This map shows the Ayyubid Empire at its greatest extent. As you can see, it's a pretty good empire, but still a lot of parts of the Middle East that are not under his control. More importantly, the Mamluks are going to come to feature much more prominently in terms of how the Ayyubid Empire is run. They become increasingly independent of the Ayyubid rulers, and eventually they're going to take over. They're just getting bigger, right? Remember, every time a contender for the throne was killed, his retinue of Mamluks would be incorporated into that army, Mamluk army of the victor. That army becoming bigger, and at some point it's not entirely clear who's running things, whether it's the highest ranking military commander, in theory a slave soldier who should answer to the Ayyubid ruler, but the Ayyubid ruler becoming very dependent on his Mamluk army, and that gives them a lot of leverage. Further complicating matters is that during the period of the Ayyubid Empire, the Crusades are continuing, right? So you have kind of successive military campaigns. One of the more famous led by, and this time we have royalty involved, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France. This is when the Crusaders are still able to maintain a foothold in the northern part of Israel-Palestine, the city of Acre. Here we see an image of them receiving the keys to Acre. Eventually they're able to negotiate some kind of modus vivendi with the Ayyubids, whereby they're allowed to, again, trying to maintain Christian pilgrimage and so forth. But this is also a destabilizing factor for the Ayyubids. And matters pretty much coming to a head with the Seventh Crusade, led by Louis IX of France, again, led by royalty. This crusade takes place between 1248 and 1254. And this will actually bring the Ayyubid dynasty pretty much to an end, largely because this time they're going to try something different. Rather than going straight for the Holy Land or trying to take advantage of the fact that they still have a foothold in the city of Acre, they're going to try and take out Egypt, right? Eliminate any potential resistance and then use Egypt as a kind of stepping stone to take over the Holy Land. And, this plan will fail in the end. They're not going to actually succeed in retaking the Holy Land. But the battle that takes place at the beginning will see the last real sultan of the Ayyubid dynasty, Salih Ayyub, die. There will be a number of individuals who lay claim to the throne, But in the end, it will be the Mamluks who seize control. They're going to take advantage of the kind of destabilized situation brought about by the death of this sultan, by the fact that they are now under attack by the Seventh Crusade, the army of the Seventh Crusade. And one Mamluk commanding officer will rise to the occasion, a fellow named Baybars, who will then eventually seize the sultanate for himself. So first succeeding in defeating the army of the Seventh Crusade, but then eventually laying the foundation for a new dynasty, what we refer to as the Mamluk dynasty. Not a dynastic family name, but kind of a reference to the fact that for some time to come, the ruler of this sultanate based in Egypt will always be a Mamluk. Before we get to that, though, there's one more threat that Baybars is going to have to confront, and that is the Mongol invasion, which is a kind of global phenomena, at least as far as the old world goes. Europe, Asia, the Middle East. Well, okay, not Africa, but nonetheless, right? This is not just something the Middle East is going to experience. It's going to have a huge impact in China, in what today is Russia, in East Europe, and definitely in the Middle East. So who are these Mongols, right? Well, the Mongols roughly corresponding in terms of point of origin with the modern nation state of Mongolia. And so the people who live there today would claim to be descended from these Mongols. And as often happened throughout history in many different parts of the world, particularly what we might call steppe regions that have limited resources and are not able to support large populations, at some point as the population grew, it created pressure on people to basically migrate, sometimes in large numbers and sometimes in a very militaristic way. And that's pretty much what happened here. A major factor in why it ended up being a kind of militaristic expansion is that you had one individual who was able to unite the Mongol tribes that up until then tended to be very independent of one another. And that was, of course, very famously Genghis Khan, born in 1162 or thereabouts, and united the Mongols in 1227. Proved to be a very effective political and military leader, took the title of Khan, or Khan, if you will, united the Mongols, and then founded the Mongol Empire, which was vast and would impact many different civilizations, not only the Middle East. By the time of his death, the territory you see indicated here under Mongol control, but the expansion would continue under his sons and grandsons. And at some point, different individuals leading different campaigns in different directions. We, of course, are interested in what was going on in the Middle East. In this case, it is the Mongol ruler and grandson of Genghis Khan, Hulagu Khan, born in 1217, died in 1265, who will end up conquering most of the Muslim lands of the Middle East and will bring the Abbasid Caliphate to an end in 1258. And so that was a very, very destructively impactful event in the Islamic world, as you might imagine. As the story goes, basically what happened is at some point after conquering a village, the Mongols had demanded their complete submission, complete loyalty, and the response had been something along the lines of, well, ultimately we owe our allegiance to the Caliph. It is to he that we are most loyal. At which point the Mongols responded, who is this Caliph and where does he live? And after being informed of that, they went to Baghdad and basically razed the city to the ground and not only killed the caliph, but killed his entire family to ensure that the line came to an end, very famously by wrapping them up in carpets and trampling them to death with horses. And as you might imagine, I mean, this was a really traumatic event in the Middle East. And at some point, it really looked as if the Mongols were going to succeed in conquering the entirety of the Middle East. They are finally defeated and pushed back by the Mamluks. Right? So the first Mamluk dynasty established at the time of the Seventh Crusade, but then they go on to defeat the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut, located in roughly what today is Israel-Palestine in 1260, and then eventually consolidated their control over Syria in addition to Egypt, where they were based. The Mongols, by the way, will maintain control of parts of the Middle East, will eventually establish their own empires there. The Mongol world will become politically fragmented. And pretty much in every case, the Mongols, in terms of how they organize things politically, culturally, and so forth, being absorbed by whatever was the dominant civilization in that territory. So in the case of China, for instance, eventually adapting Chinese government, Chinese administrative practices, Chinese language, and so forth. Same deal in the Middle East. Right? But some part of the Middle East will not ever come under Mongol control. That will be under the control of a new dynasty, the Mamluks, who will be the subject of our next lecture.